They called her Monster. Hollywood later turned her life into a prize-winning movie, but behind the headlines was a life that began in pain, neglect, and survival. In the next 75 minutes, we will follow the path of a woman whose name became synonymous with fear, and whose story forced a country to wrestle with sex, violence, and justice. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos, born into chaos in 1956 in rural Michigan, abandoned as a child, folded into a world of abuse and early survival. We don't start with the killings, we start with the cracks. A father who was a convicted child molester and later died in prison, a mother who left, and a young girl pushed out of the life that should have protected her. From the outside, her life looked like a descent. School dropped, pregnant at 14, expelled, and on the road. But the road also became the only place she could breathe. For Aileen, hitchhiking was not freedom, it was survival. She learned fast how to get by, how to disappear, and how to trade what she had for the next day's safety. This is the context you must hold in your head as we move forward, a person broken long before the headlines labeled her. Stay with us because at minute 6, we'll see the first moment that changed everything, a violent encounter that would be told differently in court and in whispers, depending on who was listening. For now, listen to the sound of the highway, empty, indifferent, and in Aileen's life, the stage of what was to come. Aileen Wuornos was not born a killer. She was born into a family that failed her. Her father's crimes and imprisonment cascaded into abandonment. Her mother left. She and her brother were raised by grandparents. But abuse followed. By 14, she was pregnant and cast out. That child was given up. Imagine the girl who held a baby and then watched the baby go away. That hole never closed. As she drifted into her teens, Aileen learned to survive by any means necessary. Hitchhiking, petty crimes, odd jobs, and eventually prostitution became the lines on which she balanced. She carried distrust like armor. People who meet Aileen in her teens and 20s remember a hard edge, an instinct to protect herself first, before anyone else. In 1986, a person entered Aileen's life who would be called everything from savior to accomplice. Tyria Moore, younger, quieter, and affectionate, became Aileen's lover. For the first time, Aileen had a partner who stayed. Witnesses later said Tyria offered a rare tenderness, a small household, a shared bed, and the constant pressure of life on the margins. This relationship will be central later, the woman who would both love Aileen and be used by investigators to find the truth.
The first man was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old store owner. In December 1989, his disappearance and the discovery of his abandoned car started the trail. Aileen's later confession said she shot him in self-defense after he tried to assault her. Investigators found his camera and possessions pawned, and Mallory's body turned up days later in a wooded area. For detectives, the scene suggested something darker than a single act of survival. What was at stake? Aileen's life and the fragile code she had developed. Take what you need and leave before you are taken. The camera, the pawned items, the abandoned car. These were threads that would eventually tie back to her. But in this moment, in winter 1989, no one could have guessed this was the start of a pattern. Middle-aged men disappearing along the highways of Florida. We understand Aileen's claim of self-defense, but we also see the pattern now emerging. The theft, the abandoned vehicles, the bodies left along quiet roads. Two possibilities start to coexist: self-defense and premeditation. Both will shape public perception. Who notices the pattern, and what leads detectives to Aileen?
As spring and summer of 1990 arrived, more men vanished. David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams. Each disappearance nudged the investigation from strange tragedy to serial pattern. Some bodies were found with multiple gunshot wounds. Some cars were left abandoned. One of the victims, Peter Seams, never had his body recovered, leaving an ache of unknown detail that haunts investigations. For Aileen, there was a mounting internal conflict. Her life had been a string of choices born from need, but with each killing, she also carried the memory of the assault she later described. Was she fighting predators or hunting clients? In defense interviews, she said the men tried to rape or kill her. Prosecution saw robbery and calculation. The clash of narratives would define the courtroom drama to come. The audience begins to suspect an organized method. Hitch, meet, take advantage, then, sometimes, a violent end. The stakes, a woman's freedom versus the lives of those men. The audience is now in the uncomfortable place of feeling both repulsion and pity.
Detectives are patient. Small mistakes become big breaks. When items from Mallory turned up at pawn shops and in a storage unit in Daytona Beach, investigators traced the rental under an alias. The key, literally, to that unit was linked to someone who had been seen with Mallory's car. The car itself, when recovered, showed signs that tied it back to a person living on the margins. The net tightened when law enforcement, following the paper trail, noticed two women living together, Aileen and Tyria. Detectives started to focus not on the usual suspects, but on a profile that upended assumptions, a woman as the aggressor. For some officers, it was hard to imagine. For others, the evidence was evidence. Pawned goods, abnormal patterns, abandoned cars. How do you get a confession from someone like Aileen? In the next part, we'll see how detectives leveraged the one person closest to her.
Tyria Moore's role is complicated. She was lover, housemate, and ultimately the person who would help detectives get the confession that cracked the case. In January 1991, Aileen was arrested on an unrelated warrant. Tyria, already suspicious and frightened, cooperated. On January 16th, police arranged for Tyria to place a phone call to Aileen, a call that detectives secretly recorded. In that conversation, Aileen admitted to Mallory's killing. This moment is heartbreaking and cinematic. The person who shared a bed with Aileen becomes the instrument of her downfall. For Aileen, it was a betrayal she would later resent and for which she would never forgive Tyria. For viewers, it is a gutting test of loyalty, love versus justice. Tyria would later testify and describe a life lived in fear. Investigators now have the confession and enough evidence to bring charges, but the story has only intensified. Next, the courtroom and the public spectacle.
By late 1991, Aileen was in court. The prosecution laid out a picture of premeditated murder and robbery. The defense offered a starkly different narrative, a woman who shot in self-defense after attempted rapes and attacks. In the courtroom's bright lights, Aileen's past, abuse, prostitution, mental instability became evidence and argument. As the trial unfolded, the media smelled something larger than a criminal case. Talk shows, news segments, and documentaries crowded in. Editors searched for a headline, "Female Serial Killer," a label the country hadn't digested. Defense witnesses painted Aileen as a deeply traumatized survivor. Prosecutors tendered a pattern of theft and killing for profit. Aileen herself often reacted poorly in court, shouting, swearing, collapsing into rage. Those displays did not help the defense. The jury watched both testimony and temper. The first conviction for Richard Mallory came with a death sentence on January 27, 1992. How would Aileen's mental state and old trauma factor into sentencing and appeals? We'll explore psychiatric testimony next. Throughout the legal process, psychologists weighed in. Diagnoses included borderline personality disorder, paranoid features, and evidence, experts said, of delusional thinking. Testimony described many psychotic episodes, chronic mistrust, and impulsive rage. For the defense, this was mitigation. For the prosecution, it was background to a pattern. A key theme, trauma shapes behavior but does not justify homicide in the court's eyes. Aileen's life was a catalog of failures. Failed relationships, failed attempts to find safety, failed systems that should have protected her. She sometimes seemed to want punishment. She waived appeals later on, as if her personal guilt or exhaustion preferred an end. Psychological testimony deepened public debate.
Was Aileen a monstrously violent predator, or a profoundly broken person who had been failed by society? The audience is pulled in two directions, and that moral tug becomes the emotional heart of the film.
Enjoying the case so far? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more crime stories every week. Rather than face multiple new trials, Aileen entered guilty and no contest pleas on several charges in 1992-1993. Each plea brought another death sentence. In total, she was given 6 death sentences. The courtroom eruptions, her cries of "I'm innocent, I was raped," echoed across newsrooms and talk shows. Some saw them as evidence of torment. Others heard a manipulative final act. Public opinion hardened. Figures who had once argued for a nuanced approach found themselves shouting for justice for the victims' families. Advocacy groups debated whether trauma should change sentencing. Columnists asked whether society's margins can create killers. We'll later reveal details about one victim's past that complicates the simple good versus evil story and reopens the debate. Aileen spent nearly a decade on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark. Life on death row is rhythm without hope. Visits, appeals, paperwork, and the slow invasion of institutional life. She wrote letters, made enemies, and sometimes lashed out. She claimed abuses by prison staff and grew increasingly erratic. Many of her supporters argued her mental state deteriorated behind bars. A dramatic moment. In 2002, the governor briefly stayed her execution for a psychiatric evaluation. For a time, the state had to answer, was she competent to be executed? 3 state psychiatrists concluded she understood why she was being punished and was competent, and the stay was lifted. The march toward the end accelerated. The audience is left to wonder, can a system that takes so long ever be just? Coming up, the execution day and the final statement. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She was 46. In her final moments, she made rambling cinematic statements, invoking imagery like "sailing with the rock" and cryptic comments that both startled and saddened listeners. She said she would be back, like a blockbuster movie line. Those words would become a final, unsettling echo. For victims' families, the execution closed a painful chapter. For critics, the scene reopened old arguments about capital punishment and the ethics of ending a life that many argued had been shaped by cruelty. For advocates who had rallied for her, the end felt wrong. For those who demanded justice, relief. But what did the evidence really show? Were the killings self-defense or robbery? Next, we step behind the headlines to a twist that complicates everything. The blood twist in Aileen's story isn't sensationalized gore. It's the discovery that one of her victims, Richard Mallory, had a criminal past that included sexual assault convictions. When this emerged, it complicated the simple narrative of predator versus prey. For those who believed Aileen's claims of being attacked, this fact reopened questions of motive and proportion. But it also raised new questions. Does one man's criminal past erase the lives lost? Does it justify murder? Or does it point to a cycle where victims become violent in turn? This twist forced the public to hold discomfort. The world is not cleanly divided into villains and saints. Viewers are asked to sit with complexity. The law gave a verdict, but history resists simple closure. The film Monster and documentaries like Aileen, Portrait of a Serial Killer, framed Aileen's story for mass audiences. Charlize Theron's Oscar-winning portrayal humanized Aileen, showing a woman who was at once terrifying and tragic. Documentaries portrayed the social context, early abuse, poverty, and a justice system that often fails the vulnerable. Media can humanize or dehumanize. For Aileen, the media cycle did both, sometimes giving her a voice, sometimes reducing her to lurid headlines. Supporters argued the media's later sympathy hinted at society's guilt. Critics said we were romanticizing a murderer. Both debates matter because they shaped how future generations understand violence, trauma,
and justice. How should history remember Aileen? As a monster, a victim, or a cautionary tale? Scholars, psychologists, and ethicists have argued about Aileen's case for decades. Some see clear signs of borderline and paranoid personality disorders, likely linked to early trauma. Others place her violence in a larger pattern of violence against sex workers and people on the margins. The case invites larger questions. How do we define culpability when life has inflicted relentless harm? When is self-defense a true defense, and when is it a cover? This section invites viewers to reflect, not to judge quickly, but to examine systems, child welfare, poverty, the criminal justice system, and media sensationalism. Aileen's life is a mirror that shows cracks in institutions we assume protect people, and how those cracks ripple outward into tragedy. The audience gains a broader lens to judge, not only the woman, but the world that produced her.
Aileen Wuornos was executed, but her story did not end in that needle or on that gurney. It persists in documentaries, debates, and in the uneasy space where empathy meets accountability. She was not simply a monster. She was a person who had been repeatedly harmed, who harmed others, and who forced a nation to ask difficult questions about gender, violence, and punishment. The narrative we followed is not meant to absolve or to condemn absolutely. It is meant to complicate, to humanize without excusing. The story's stakes were life and death, and the lesson is that pain left unaddressed can multiply.
If this story moved you, here are 3 things you can do next. Watch the archived interviews and documentaries referenced in the description to see the original footage. Leave a comment with your perspective. Were her actions self-defense, revenge, or something else? Engage respectfully. Subscribe for more deep dives into complex cases like this. Next week, a case that asks a different question: how wrongful convictions turn ordinary people into symbols. Don't miss it.